Right, good morning. Let's make a start. So in this session, we'll be using the app to be voting on some questions. So if you haven't already, please get it up and available, and you might just have enough time to download it and register if you haven't already done so. So here's a photo of me graduating from university almost 20 years ago now. I studied environmental science at the University of Manchester. I quite like this photo because it's got several members of my family in. So there's me, obviously, in the foreground. Over my left shoulder is my mum, Claire, with the glasses. She also graduated from the University of Manchester about 15 years before I did. And over my right shoulder, the very blurred lady there, is my mother's mum, my grandmother. Also, I tried to crop this before, but production has been on this slide. The sort of head cut off there, that's my ex-girlfriend. She's no longer in the picture. So, going to university, as many of you will know, is quite an experience. You gain your independence, often moving away from home. You pursue the knowledge that you're interested in. And you also have quite an active social life with societies, new people to meet, lots of parties, nights out and so forth. I probably overindulged a bit too much on this social life and ended up missing a few lectures in my first year. Didn't use the library as much as I should and started getting some poor coursework grades. This culminated with me failing a couple courses at the end of the first year, and I had to go back over the summer and study for resits, like a few shamed individuals have to every year. I also had a good friend on the course called Benjamin Lovely, not quite his real name, but he was an extremely popular chap. Everyone really liked him. One party, there was a helium canister in the corner for filling up helium balloons, sort of thing you do at a party. He decided to take helium direct from the tank, I don't know how he didn't pop his lung, and go around speaking a very high-pitched voice to people and answering phones. And these are the days when mobile phones were new, so it was quite a novel experience. It also tried to chat up ladies by using the name, "Hi, my name's Lovely, what's yours?" It didn't get him very far. So, he also failed some courses in the summer. He wouldn't say how many, but unfortunately I couldn't get him to join me in studying for resits and trying to come back for the second year. He disengaged, and when I did return for the second year, I never heard from him again. I've always hoped that he's doing well, but I don't know. Now imagine a technology that could monitor your attendance, your library use, your VLE use. VLE didn't exist at the time, but I've got an idea of what it is, and coursework grades. And that technology could help indicate to you and your tutors and the teaching staff that you weren't quite on track to succeed. Imagine a technology that could allow you to analyze the curriculum, see where student engagement is high, and see where it's not. This would be very helpful for optimizing courses and programs and achieving excellence through analytics. And imagine a technology, in the case of my friend Benjamin Lovely, that could identify his issues that he was suffering at the time and allow early intervention. And imagine that intervention was successful. He would have had a successful time at university and graduated. The university would have kept the income for the subsequent years he studied, and perhaps at a time where he was at risk of harm, he would have got the help and support he needed. Such a technology is learning analytics, and it has the power to make a real difference to students. So my name is Nas Newbury, Head of Technical Programs at Jisc. I help deliver new technology to the sector, and I've helped bring Jisc's learning analytics solution to our members. In this session, we'll be exploring excellence from analytics and the journey that several institutions are taking. The early adopters are our panel here. We'll be using the app to vote on some questions, so please, as I said, have your phones ready. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel, starting from left to right.
Right, good morning everyone, my name's Ed Foster. I work at Nottingham Trent University. We've been using learning analytics since our pilot in 2013-14 and rolled it out across the whole of the institution in 14-15. The tool we use is specifically available to both students and staff. We see that both agents have changed in the process of using learning analytics. And since that pilot, or since rolling it out across the institution, students have logged onto the dashboard, as we call it, 1.7 million times, and staff around 150,000 times, generating lots of notes and lots of interactions. The tool we use is developed in partnership with a company called Solution Path. And I'm very aware that there are lots of suppositions around Niles' introduction, and I'm very aware that some of the challenges around learning analytics are, yes, we can identify students at risk potentially, but there still needs to be action and change. And I think that for me is the real challenge of all of this tech, is that that's lovely and delightful, but what next? And I hope that's part of where this discussion goes.
Good morning everyone, my name's Carl Malden. I'm from the University of Greenwich and I've been working on the rollout of our learning analytics project for the last 3 years. I've been leading on quite a few aspects of it, mostly on the data side, but I'm involved in the sort of policy development side, the training side of staff and students. We're using the Jisc system, so we're using Data Explorer for staff and Study Goal for students. We rolled it out last year in October and November to just over 700 staff, and about, I think, 12,000 students have access to it. I ran the stats yesterday. 45% of our staff, of our tutors, have now accessed the system, and we are starting to get some sort of anecdotal, qualitative feedback from them about what they think about the system. I've also got access to sort of all the data because I'm kind of one of the main admin users of it. I'm starting to see some patterns develop in certain areas, and we're going to be looking at over the next 6 months. We're going to be looking at trying to formalise what we know about the system, both qualitatively from staff and students and quantitatively from the data. We're also concerned about looking at, we were aware that different departments in our university have used the systems that feed into the service in a different way. So we have a VLE, our attendance monitoring system, and our student record system, but each department kind of approaches things differently. So we want to look at how those different patterns sort of affect the output of the data as well. So that's kind of where we are.
Thanks, Carl. So, morning everybody. Nick Moore, I'm the Director of Libraries and IT at the University of Gloucestershire. Like Carl and like Martin in a minute, we are one of the Jisc Pathfinders. We've been working with Jisc for about 4 years. We're in a kind of advanced stage of pilot rollout. We've been taking a while to roll out the system, mainly because it's not a straightforward introduction or change to the way the academics work, and we wanted to make sure that we did it with an appropriate pace for the institution. We've got roughly a third of the tutors, which is mostly the senior tutors, who are now actively using it. One of the things that we were keen to do is use the attendance capture as part of the rollout. So actually, almost all of the students have interacted it in some way or another in terms of using it as an attendance function. And that is quite an interesting way of introducing them to how they might then use the learning analytics data.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Leon Doughty from the University of East Anglia. We're slightly unusual insofar as we're just at the brink of about to pilot our implementation of learning analytics. I think it's fair to say we've faced a couple of key challenges thus far. Firstly, technically, our new academic model that we introduced some years ago now introduces, basically the model was designed to have more formative assessment earlier on in the teaching, with summative assessment coming later on. And with a system that's designed or intended to identify issues at an early stage, what we've essentially done is to introduce quite a lot of delays in our data. So it means that only really about this time of year do we get enough data in our system to really start providing a meaningful set of data to our staff to look at. So that's one of the challenges that we've faced, has just been getting our own data house in order, actually. The second is a cultural one. At UEA, we have 4 key faculties which vary from humanities through to Faculty of Health and Sciences. And health and sciences and some of the more vocational parts of the university are very keen early adopters of this. However, at our sort of softer, more traditional academic humanities end of the university, there's quite a few cultural challenges involved there. They're, I think, less inclined to do activities that they see as spoon-feeding or excessively intervening. So there's quite a few cultural changes that would need to be addressed there. There's early adopters within each of those cultures, and equally there's sort of more conservative thinking in even the more vocational parts of the university. So it's not a sort of homogenous situation for any of the faculties, but that's the sort of the broad picture that we're facing and that's challenging us.
Morning everyone, Martin Lynch, University of South Wales. Like Nick, we're one of the Pathfinder institutions, so we started about the same time, 2016. We're different in the sense that we were lucky enough at the university to have quite a substantial investment in staff resource. So we're lucky enough to have a full-time learning technologist on the project and a developer. So we've made quite a lot of progress in terms of outputs and engagement. So our engagement right now, we went for a mass rollout in September last year. So currently we're looking at about 455 staff who are regularly using the dashboard, about 3,000 students. I'm not quite sure if that's a big number. We were just asking earlier, apparently that's quite good. So we've got an awful lot of activity, and like Nick at Gloucester and Greenwich, the three institutions, we're all going to be doing a sort of joint impact assessment to properly understand what themes are emerging from all this activity. So we went in assuming a certain model of engagement for the staff, that we assumed that the staff would use the product in a certain way. It seems that they're not entirely using it in this way, which is kind of interesting. So I think what we're attempting to do at the university is run this not like a classic implementation of technology, because it impacts on too many stakeholders and too many aspects of the business. But it's being done in a much more thoughtful, sensitive way. So our project board has got many of the main directors. So it's hooked up to strategy, and we're getting really good response from the staff about the manner in which we've rolled it out. So it's not being seen as a sort of top-down IT project, which I think is the right way to go. So it's early days. As I say, we'll know, we'll have mined some of the nuggets over the next 3 or 4 months. So watch this space.
Thank you very much. Welcome. So we've got an initial set of questions that I'd like to now ask you to use the app to vote upon. That's if you go into the app and go into this session, towards the bottom you'll see it says vote for your question, or words to that effect. And so please have a cast of the vote, and we will then answer those questions that turn out to be in demand and in popular. And then, time permitting, we'll move on to open questions, any other questions that you may have. So I'll just go through them quickly now. They are: does learning analytics actually deliver benefits? Is learning analytics ethical? What are the unintended consequences of learning analytics? Can learning analytics predict mental health issues? Surely learning analytics solutions miss most learning activity? And can learning analytics cope with diverse learning styles? Thank you. So we're just getting the results of the poll in. Please bear with us. And we have. Interesting. I'm not sure if that's quite worked. Let's bear with us one moment. We're just seeing if we can refresh the page. I see the results coming now. Just bear with me a moment. Thank you. Voila, here we go. Right, nice spread. Thank you very much. And the first question has proved the most popular, which is, does learning analytics actually deliver benefits? May I ask who from the panel would want to open to that one? Yes, Ed.
Okay, I'll happily answer this. So I think I said in my introduction that we see there are two fundamental users in the way that we use learning analytics, the students themselves and the staff, predominantly personal tutors, but also staff involved in student support services, academic libraries, where they offer that second line form of support. So we can see there are a number of benefits of learning analytics. Number one, learning analytics is a good predictor of student success. So the algorithm that we use focuses only on student engagement, not on their demographic background. And we can see from very early in the first term, there's a good prediction between student success and the amount of engagement they have measured by learning analytics. But that's interesting, but not particularly useful. It's the what next, if you like. From a student perspective, we can see there's a correlation between those students who use the learning analytics tool more and student success. So those students that are using it to self-regulate their own learning, there's an association there. Obviously, we can't prove that the dashboard drives engagement or drives that success, but we can see that for those students using it, there's an association there of success. We don't think we've seen a categorical shift in progression or attainment, but what we can say very clearly is where we talk to staff who've used it as a tool to support students in one-to-one tutorials, we see a very, very strong usefulness. There's a real benefit in terms of how staff use it to start conversations with students in one-to-ones. We have a series of alerts that the system generates, and again, that helps staff in terms of their one-to-one discussions with students going forwards. The other thing that we found that we weren't expecting to find is that there are real benefits from a research perspective. So if we take a look at engagement, the system that we use gives you an overnight engagement score. It gives you a daily updatable score. And what it allows us to do is to take a look at some of the interventions that we've put into place. So for example, we ran a series of activities around early induction or our induction activities, and we could see very quickly that those students who took part in those activities there was an association with progression and success. But the other thing that we've done is where our students go and speak to our academic librarians looking for study support or referencing support, we've always had an understanding that those students tend to do better. But what we've been able to demonstrate is that what's going on is the students who go out and seek support from academic librarians are already the ones who were already a little bit more engaged, a bit more switched on, and so they were using the support to facilitate their processes. It wasn't that the librarians transformed student engagement, it was that there was a process going on that the students had self-initiated. And for me, it flags at some real issues around forms and models of support that we offer to students. If we are reliant upon students seeking help for themselves, we are likely to support better the students who already have the skills and capacities to do that. And so it flags at some really interesting issues for us, I think, around thinking how we offer support to students as an institution. It's me wittering it up.
Thank you, Ed. Appreciate that. Are there any additional views on benefits? Yes, Nick, please.
So I guess just to kind of extend what Ed said, there's a difference between prediction and just using the data, and I think that's, we're earlier in the cycle than Ed is, but there is a real benefit in just having the data and using the data. Firstly, you never really know how good your data is until you actually try to use it, so it drives out an awful lot of inconsistency. You need to know who's teaching who's the tutor of who, all those kind of basic stuff. Once you start using that data, you actually have a much more powerful data set that's available to you. It also starts making you think about how you are, what it's reflecting about the learning process as well. So when you look at a whole bunch of different module data, it kind of tells you something interesting about why are some modules completely different when you look at the data from others. Without the prediction, you can pretty much find every pattern of student engagement in a module that led to any kind of permutation or outcome. That's where the model comes in. But it does really show you at a glance the difference in style and approaches to the different modules that are taught, some of which just seems like it hasn't been thought through. So you then start the data then starts the conversation about, okay, how are we designing some of these courses and are we sharing practice? So it then starts taking you beyond what you kind of even now, before you initially thought in terms of the student data, but actually a kind of institutional benefit just by starting the conversation.
Yeah, I'd echo that. At this point in time, we don't know the benefits because we're at this point where we're measuring, but on a purely pragmatic housekeeping benefit, as Nick said, you don't know how good your data is until you actually have to use it. So the 3 years it's taken us to do the pipe laying has meant that the data has been cleaned up enormously. Just the process of asking the questions and preparing your data set for the UDD process that if you're going to join, it means you have to ask quite difficult questions because the data doesn't have to be right just because you're doing a HISA return. It has to be right all the time. And that's something that our data people have had to get their heads around. So early doors on that is a benefit. And the other thing is it picks up on something that's happening across the piece in higher education, which is the use of data and data for meaning and data for insight. So we've got our data reporting unit, which is gathering all sorts of data. Now, you know, Power BI is sort of unleashed upon the world, dashboard after dashboard after dashboard. So there's a real culture of, particularly managers anyway, wanting to look at data. And I think this has been part of a conversation around meaningful insights from data. Now, I think what we're recognizing is that there's a big difference between seeing a dashboard and getting an insight. And I think that skill set in higher education is something going forward is going to be, you're going to see, if we could afford them, data scientists working in these kind of units, because getting insight from this data is actually a very high level skill. And I think and I'm aware of this when we show down to the level of personal academic coaches. I'm really concerned about, you know, looking at a screen of data and getting meaning. There's a world of difference about how you interpret these screens. So I think from a staff development point of view, there's a long way to go on that. So in terms of benefits, it's raised a lot of questions. Benefits are, we have early doors that it's better than what people had, which was nothing. So for our staff, being able to get meaningful data to inform a conversation meant you would have to run a report from student record system, from Blackboard, which is, if anybody's trying to do that, is a miserable experience. And so bring it all into one dashboard. And for us, we had all of our assessment data, everything. And it was in a column, it was on the screen. So that's a very rich picture. So being able to do that was a million times better than what anybody else had before. Plus, check-in, attendance monitoring, lots and lots of spreadsheets, GDPR nightmare, stuff in drawers everywhere. So it started to roll over some stones and unearth all this stuff. So that's part of the process, which has been a real benefit. The students, I don't know yet. We'll see.
Thank you. And can I just ask, do any panelists feel there's been some hard benefits from students yet in terms of their experience? Please, Ed.
So by hard, do you mean statistical impact on the number of students retained, or do you mean satisfaction and experience?
I'll happily take either at this point.
Okay. So, well, I think, as I say, we've struggled with, we've not struggled, we think it's an almost impossible job to prove that showing an impact on one cohort compared to the other, because there's so many changes between what's gone on over the time that we've been doing learning analytics. Our first year intake's gone up massively, and we've also taken on students from far more diverse qualifications. So I think we've just trying to prove between one year and the next, I think, is extremely difficult. We do a first year survey each year with our students, and we get lots of very rich feedback. And I think it's very telling that we had a quite difficult year last year for lots of growing pains reasons. And what we saw in 2016, about 65% of our students said that they see the dashboard as a useful tool to them. Last year it dropped to 48%, and this year it's just gone, we've just done the survey again, and it goes back up to 3/4. So this is students describing that they can see this benefit in actually keeping and using it for a sense check. We've got lots of more qualitative feedback. We've got students describing how some of the survey responses I've been looking at. Students are describing how they saw that their engagement had dipped, and for them it was very motivational. We had a discussion with a student last year who was talking about how she'd had some real kind of motivational issues that potentially verged on mental health concerns, and for her what was really valuable was to just see that kind of sense of her engagement dipping, and that kind of then feeling the need to do something with that. And we see again from staff that they've used the data because of either an alert that's been generated, or because they can see the pattern of student engagement and the way it's displayed visually. It's caused them then to make contact with the student in a way that they may not have done previously until after a failed assignment or after something had gone wrong more seriously. And there's a very strong sense from those staff that there's real benefits in having those conversations early. They may not have been able to stop or prevent the student from withdrawing early, but what they were able to do is have a much more meaningful conversation and allow the student to make a more informed decision about what to do next and where to go for further support. So yes, we've seen definite benefits for students and to some extent for staff too.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ed. Thank you. All right, I'd like to move on to the next most popular question, which is, what are the unintended consequences of learning analytics? Would any of the panel like to take that one? Yes, Nick, again, please.
Well, I'll just start off with one. So the thing that's come out really clearly in talking to some of the students is, in a way, the link that they make, which is absolutely not what we intend and don't do, but the link between assessment and the learning analytics system. I guess partly that is, it doesn't matter how clear you make an instruction or a use or a policy, people will describe things in the way that they do, in the language that's comfortable with them. So that the way that some of the academics have described what the system enables them to do with the students has led the students to conclude that the academic is having a look at the dashboard first and then therefore changing the assessment marks on the basis that, well, clearly this is rubbish because you've not been in the library or you've not done any of the things that you should have done, so therefore this. It is not what they are actually doing, just to make that clear, but it is in the mind of the students, the kind of unintended consequence was that it's raised that kind of risk. So we've actually put far more work into making sure that the policy is absolutely clear to the students and absolutely clear to the staff. We are now spending far more time than I think we originally expected, in a way coaching the personal tutors and the senior tutors on how you actually describe how you use the dashboard in a supportive way, to overemphasize in a way to the students that there is no link between assessment and what the dashboard is saying. I don't think we would have expected it to be quite such a difficult issue to communicate for something around something that is a positive benefit to the student.
Thank you, Nick. Very insightful. Are there any other unintended comments? Yes, Leon?
Yeah, I was just going to really raise just the point that Martin raised earlier and I touched on when I started, which was unintended consequences. Sure, those on the students, but actually at the moment at our institution we're just really struggling or have been struggling for a while, to get our data right. And for those of you in the room, I work in a planning office, so the term data futures is very familiar to me and to my colleagues, but for those of you out in the room, data futures is something that's very much on the horizon. He's his sort of drive to much more real-time data. And actually for us, I think the biggest challenge going forward, not just with data analytics, but on a broader level actually, is getting data in a timely fashion. And that's a real challenge that you guys probably need to be getting going on now, if you're not already started on it, is to work with your student support services of one variety or another to make sure that your data streams are getting in and all in a line at an early point as possible, because these things have massive implications for the way in which your administrations run. So for us, for instance, just getting marks data in a timely fashion, it's an issue for our NSS, but it's also an issue just administratively in terms of the processes involved and the sheer number of staff. We're talking of hundreds of staff involved in gathering that data, entering it, etc., etc. So even before we get to the actual data itself and sending that off to Jisc, there are huge implications for your administrative arms, potentially in this area. And that's certainly one, the thing that's sort of, it's changing the way in which we're looking at learn analytics. I don't think we're going to be in a position anytime shortly to use learn analytics, say for instance, within the first term of somebody arriving at our institution, which is much to our annoyance, and that's our problem at our end. Whereas by perhaps the end of the year, we do have enough data to have a meaningful discussion in that way. So whilst some of my colleagues probably have got different data systems, different administrations, I would certainly encourage those in the audience to take a really good hard look at your data streams now, not just for data futures, but for your own internal administrative and monitoring and purposes. That if you're trying to do anything in any live way, you need really good live data, and that means gathering it in a fresh way.
One thing I might pick up on is it's not quite unintended consequence because it's, as I say, it's too early to say. But one of the unexpected uses of the dashboard is we were doing a bit of training for the finance unit, and they said, "You've given us this incredible forensic tool." And we were like, "Why?" Well, if a student claims that they've disengaged in term 2, we can now evidence that they haven't disengaged, that they've actually accessed services. So you've saved us thousands of pounds of court fees, because we would usually settle out of court. And it was like, oh, no. Because that story could be taken so... And I don't think it's unethical. We then went to went through the ethics mills just to work, well, is that... Well, not really, because that's kind of evidencing in another way, but it's just saved them an awful lot of time. So I'm sure that wasn't planned when the Jisc team were thinking about what should we create a dashboard for forensic investigation of financial. So that's just one thing that we picked up on as a kind of interesting unintended use.
Thank you, Martin. I'd like to take the opportunity to segue. You mentioned the word ethics there, so I'd like to segue into the ethics question, which is learning analytics ethical? Would anyone like to take that one? Yes, Carl?
Yeah, excuse me. So a good friend of mine is a PhD philosopher, so I actually called her last night to have a discussion about this. I didn't really understand much of it. I don't think moral philosophy is really my thing, but it occurs to me that data in itself is neither ethical nor unethical. It's how you use it. So I think it's about the framework in which it is used, and that is pretty much down to the learning analytics policy. And I think the key thing about that is about being honest. So it's about being honest with staff and students. I think in this sort of sense it means transparency. So it's the way in which you're using the data, and that is made very clear to all of the users about what it is that you're doing with it. And that's about the source systems that you're going to be taking the data from, the processes that you're going to be putting it through, and the potential results of that going through whatever processes you're putting it through, making that very clear. And so what we have is what we think, and I think we borrowed it from Gloucester anyway, but we have a very clear sort of learning analytics policy that our staff can access, and a version of that for students that's sort of, it's the same information but written in a different way for students to digest. So yeah, and thinking about it a bit further, I think using data from educational systems to try and have a positive impact on the students' educational outcomes, that seems to me like, and given that a university's mission is to educate students to the best of their ability, I think that seems ethical to me. So.
Thank you, Carl. That's good.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
So coming over on the train this morning, there was quite an interesting small debate started on Twitter from an American, I presume he's American, or follow picking up on a Guardian article that I think it connects to one of the speakers at a parallel session. And he'd taken a very, very, again, I'm presuming it's a he, his hand looks male, taking a very strong stance against the use of data and learning analytics to spot or to respond to students with mental health concerns or full stop. And I think for me, everyone in this room should be queasy and uncomfortable around any question of using data on our students. We should always be challenging ourselves because there are profound and enormous ethical considerations to this. And we are moving into a world we will start to take data for granted. We won't see or think about the ethical implications of what we do with this material. For us, we took a stance that if we had information in our systems that said a student was at risk of not succeeding or failing or dropping out early, surely we had some kind of responsibility to act at this point. And I'm aware that if you take a very negative stance on this, that's very like that uncomfortable any means justifies the ends argument. And I don't believe that's true. I believe that there is genuinely something of value that we can use data for. But there are real issues of free will. There are real issues of, we have a paradigm of the student as an adult, as, to take another line, as a paying customer, as someone who has autonomy and the right to make decisions for themselves, versus our perspective of, we are an institution with data about students, we have knowledge, we have wisdom, we have foresight, we have a role to play, I would argue, in offering insights and the capacity for students to give students information that they just simply won't have because of their lack of life experience up until that point. So for me, there is an inherent tension around the ethics of this. For me, I do believe intervening and offering support is the right thing to do, but it should never be seen as a totally ethics-free zone. There's another issue that we should all bear in mind, and that is that even if all of us are acting in the most ethical fashion that we can, and our responses to students at risk are profoundly sound in the way that we act, learning analytics has a tendency to put the onus onto the student. What learning analytics does is say this student is engaging less than their peers, or that they're doing less activity, or if you add in demographics, which I feel for me is a no-no in terms of certainly the algorithms in learning analytics, there are also then issues then of these students are potentially, it gives us a risk of students' chances of success. But there's a trap here, and that is that it goes, this student's got low engagement, potentially it's easy to fall into that nature of, well, it's their responsibility, it's their fault. And what learning analytics dashboards won't do is give you any insight into why. It won't give you any insight into the things, the barriers, the obstacles that the student has to overcome in order to take part and to succeed. So for me, there's an issue there of potentially a risk of taking the responsibility of crappy teaching, terrible facilities, off our hands and putting it onto the responsibility of the learner. So there's an ethical dimension there that we always need to bear in mind. It may be the student is not engaged with their studies because they can't be bothered. It may be because they've got all sorts of issues at home, or it may be because they're actually reacting in a very rational way to an experience that they're not very satisfied with. And so it's not just what the data tells us. We need to be careful of thinking about it through the lens of what the data is presenting to us.
Yeah, Nas wanted us to disagree, but I'm sorry, I completely agree with that. One of the interesting debates we're currently having in our board level is as well as the, using reserved words here, like the descriptive analytics, the descriptive data that's coming through. So that's just the behavior, the traffic, the visits, etc. There is this predictive potential, and in the Jisc service that's provided by a Predictor service. And this slips into what for many on the board are queasy. It's this idea about machine learning algorithms using data, training data sets. And we've taken a view that so we've had it switched on. So this is a service that's being activated for us, but we're treating it as toxic. And we've got a lot of hygiene models around it. So only a limited, basically the only person who's seeing it is the developer. So we don't want anybody to see it until we've validated it. So in the summer, we're going to do quite a robust MSc level research exercise to look at the correlations. But the queasiness comes from, as one of our board members said, the black spot. You know, if this student has the black spot on them because they've come from a certain socioeconomic group, I can't do anything about that. And despite the fact that we're as far as we understand it, the background data has an effect on the prediction, but that's swamped by activity. So it's in the background, but until, so I think there's an unethical queasiness amongst people who, understandably, because of the high-profile failures of machine learning algorithms, are worried about students being condemned or put in a box before they start. And I would absolutely pick up on what Ed was saying, that so the same people who are saying this are criticizing the fact that one of the potential models here is that education is done to an individual, and if they're failing, it's their fault. So where is the responsibility of the course team? Where does social learning come into this type of thing? So there's a risk about this approach that the dashboard is showing an individual against their peers, and it's an isolating experience. But we all know that education is much more sophisticated than that. So I think we're having those debates, and there is ethical. We've got ethical gatekeepers on our board, making us sure that we're keeping us right. So it's definitely something that doesn't stop. I mean, you've been doing it for 4 years. It's a non-ending conversation, I expect. Only getting worse.
Thank you, Martin. I'd like to now, we'll pause there for the questions from the poll. I'd like to see if anyone in the audience has any questions they'd like answered. So please show a hand if you have a question you'd like to pose to the panel. Yep, we've got one there. this microphone. I have the lovely Caitlin here too, who's very athletic.
Chuck it around nice and smooth.
Hello, James Jackson, Bishop Grosseteste University. We've just started on the Jisc Analytics project. We've been doing a lot of work. It's nice to hear some of the data cleansing stuff coming out, because I've spent most of my last sort of 3 years buried inside some sort of data mine or another, trying to figure out where exactly I'm going. Feels like a pirate ship at the end of it, or a pirate map at least. Question about the use of analytics, really from our point of view. We've heard a lot about student analytic usage, but what about curriculum? Are there any thoughts to use this information to sort of look at curriculum study, curriculum development, curriculum structure really, and how could this be used?
Nick, would you like to?
Yeah, I guess so. Plug for the fact that curriculum analytics is one of the areas that Jisc is now working with, which I think probably tells you where we are in terms of using that data for it. But yeah, absolutely. If you add all the data up on individual students, but look at it from a module, from a course perspective, it is absolutely telling you something about the module or the courses, which I think is echoing what Ed and Martin were saying about, that gives you the institutional view of what is going on, not just the learner's view. I think what we found is when you look at having a clean data set, you can do things that are really quite fun, which is look at use of Moodle sites. You can look at use of the components of Moodle sites. But the first thing you realise, which I think is what I said before, is it kind of doesn't make sense initially because there's no, certainly for us, there's no framework around which those Moodle sites or that structure has been built. So the first question we're looking at is, okay, so can you use that data to try and work out, what courses benefit from what sort of structure, or what sort of structure across all the courses is useful and metricated? Or I guess you could just go and talk to the OU, who have a embarrassingly rich data set, which is very interesting, and I hope they would give it all free to us.
Thank you, Nick. Any other thoughts on the panel on that question?
What we've seen in the evidence of our staff using the system so far is probably about a third of it is, so we've kind of looked at the page impressions. We can just about work out what people are doing with the tool. And I said at the top, our assumed model that we introduced analytics to strategically was that it was going to support personal academic coaching. So we're expecting to see staff using the dashboard to prepare for a meeting with a student. What we're seeing is that is happening, but almost as much, if not more, is happening as staff looking at my module. How are students using my module? So I think and what we're thinking until we find the actual phenomenon in detail is that this is an unmet need. This is staff who want to know how students are interacting with their material. What was the material least used, most used, what the assessment patterns, that type of thing. So if that's in a bucket of curriculum design, I'm happy with that. I think that's definitely something that's happening. One of the changes that's going on with the UDD is definitely going to be raising subject metrics up. So you're going to have the new JAX code replacement for subject appearing. So you will be eventually having much more meaningful data coming out at that curriculum level. And I think that's where the real impactful changes could occur within the way a curriculum is delivered, is actually getting course teams to, which happens anyway, there's, at the end of the delivery there is this reflection, but having the data to add a layer on top of that reflection is going to be really interesting. And it comes back to, as I said at the top, about, insights. What are the insights coming from this traffic? What does it actually mean? And that's going to be an interesting journey.
Just got
Thank you, Martin. Liam, did you have...
Yeah, just on the go back to data again. Sorry, but one of the really useful roles I think Jisc is playing in this is unlocking data sets that were previously opaque to the university sector, and on which any one institution is going to have a tough time trying to persuade, say, a VLE manufacturer company or some library data, for instance. Our library has access to all sorts of very interesting data from their suppliers, but not at an individual level, for instance, sometimes. So some of those things that will be unlocked as part of the LA journey, I think, are going to be much more useful and more broadly applicable to answer your question about how more widely can use the data set. So I think it's actually quite a rich seam of activity from which many other side benefits will come, actually, both to your own data internally as institutions, but actually on an industrial level. I think actually it gives us a lever back into our own data that's now currently sat all around the world on various servers that's quite hard to get hold of and turn into a, just agreeing data standards, for instance. I've mentioned this just before. I think that's a real value to us as a sector.
Thank you. Do we... Oh, okay, no,
Sorry.
Ed, carry on.
So perhaps because of a fault from my fault, or because of where I've come from a perhaps slightly outside the curriculum, we've not focused on this as an agenda item. I think for me, I have some slight reservations around there's issues of what we can measure and what we are measuring if we are making comparisons between courses. So in our own institution, we have fine arts students who study in an very, very different way to students who study on business or law or more traditional. And we have quite very varied, the nature of very varied courses. So I'm a little wary of the meaning that we put into this. I think what we will be doing, or we know what we're doing over the remainder of this academic year, is working on algorithms, on tailoring algorithms to make them as useful on those very different kinds of learning as is possible. So at the moment, we haven't got enough of that bespoke, personalised algorithm work on different types of learning. But once we start to do that, we've then made quite different judgments around different uses of data. I am slightly wary of some of the comparison work because for me there is an issue of what are we comparing at that point? Are we comparing a business studies course in a particular institution with another business studies course in another institution? And if so, what are we comparing? What are we making a difference of? Is there any difference between the motivation of students on those different courses? Is it to do with the access to resources? Do both institutions have the same thing? So there are some real issues that I think I'm slightly uncomfortable with. It doesn't mean that it's not the right thing to do long term, but I think we should be extremely cautious around just saying this institution is the same or is very different to this institution, or this course is the same, this is very different. There's lots to this that we just need to be careful of seeing underneath, if you like. So, no, and just go and pester Bart Rientes. He'll give you the answers on curriculum stuff, I think is the answer.
Oh, thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? Oh, quite a few now. Let's go in the middle here, the gentleman with the red tie, Mr. Marshall.
Tim Marshall, Bucks-New University, council member. I'd just be interested, when analytics pop up to a council member, they think the Holy Grail's arrived. And while I would never want to delve into operational matters, but council members do, I'd just be interested in your thoughts on how you position analytics to the governing body, to the council, to the governors of the university, what you do and what you don't tell them. I'd be interested where your thoughts are at the moment on that.
Who would like to take that one? Liam?
Only briefly, just to say that we've had a massive programme of discussion between our planning office, our Vice Chancellor's office and our council, agreeing a completely new set of key performance indicators generally. If you're talking about analytics on a more broader level, I assume you are anyway. And that was incredibly costly in terms of time and agreement, but at least I think we reduced our key performance indicators down from 270 different indicators just to a few. That's not specifically learned on analytics, I should say, but
I mean, that's really refining the spreadsheets rather than... what I'm thinking about is this more dynamic information that is coming about what's going on with students and their learning and the performance of the university. From my point of view, I'm thinking an ever more competitive world, which is your position on council. You're looking at how we're getting the edge over others. I mean, that's the world we live in now.
I think from our point of view, we would align it. The strategy that we aligned it to, like many others, was about student success. So it was, the analytics project was introduced alongside the personal academic coaching as a model for enhancing student success and ultimately retention. So we will probably, now that it's matured, it's fragmenting into other strategic agendas. And we're at the end of our planning cycle, a new planning cycle is going forward. We can already see that it's now going to be aligned to well-being, as an agenda, and that's definitely something we're all, I'm sure, going to be dealing with. So it's about which of the strands of our current strategy that you align it to, and as it embeds and spreads, it seems to be merging into just about all of them. So it's about managing all of that, those expectations. I would be very cautious about making grandiose claims to council, though, about, you know, we would all, I'm sure, close to it, be the first ones to go, well, we're just looking at it, it's just research, we can't anything concrete just yet. But you're right, I mean, I think it's one of these classic ones of a simple answer to a complex problem, and it's not.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I add? What I would do is I would take a look at the Heads of E-Learning Forum surveys in 2015 and 2017. And in 2015, 2 institutions were doing learning analytics. In 2017, it was a great big chunk. And I would probably use the line, if you don't want to be left behind, but that would be being manipulative and unprofessional.
Thank you.
Just on that one of the other aspects that's come across from our institution, in terms of our thinking at least, as far as, you know, how rapidly do we need to implement this, is sort of the legal implication that if we have data, good quality data on students, there may be a legal imperative, therefore, that if we have the data, why on earth aren't we using it for the students' benefit? If we're gathering this data, what on earth are we doing with it if we're not turning it to their benefit? So that's, I think, if it's not already a driver, I suspect could well become one quite quickly.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to take another question now, if I may, from the audience. I saw quite a few hands. Would anyone else like to ask a question? Yeah, again, the gentleman right in the middle that's probably quite hard to get to. Perhaps...
It's only a very short question. I'm Dave Kington from the heart of Worcestershire College. We're a predominantly FE institution. I was wondering if anybody has come across the use of the Jisc analytics within the FE sector.
Well, I think you identify perhaps a bit of a bias here on our panel, which are all HEs. However, there might be a member of the Jisc staff able to give some insight. And there we go. We've got a lady at the back who Gemma, who works with us in the FE space. So I'll ask Gemma to take this question, please.
So we're actually working on 6 pilots at the moment in the FE space because of that, you know. HE seems to have gone first with it, but it's certainly being looked at in FE, and we're seeing the benefits in very similar ways. It's about retention, it's about quality, and it's about student success. And the information that's been proved useful to the panel is the same information that's proving useful for FE. You know, how are we using the VLE? How are they attending? How are they engaging with the content? How are they using libraries? And you know, we're really at the start of the journey, but it is looking promising.
Yeah, please feel free to connect over lunch or another break. Are there any more questions from the audience? Gentleman over there on the far side, towards the front.
Okay, I think it was mentioned with his question about learning analytics informing curriculum design. I was wondering whether the panel think there's a tilt towards certain learning styles coming from learning analytics. Because I wonder how learning analytics can be used for fine art students. Because I imagine most of the benefit comes from being able to capture certain learning points. And I can see how easy that can be for business studies students, mathematics students, where there's a lot of sort of formal assessment points throughout the module or throughout the academic year. How does this lend itself to different types of subjects like fine arts and humanities, stuff like that?
Thank you. Good question. Who would like to take this? Leon?
Yeah, just to say, that's definitely, if nothing else, it's a data issue. But on top of that, you've then got cultural issues in the way, the pedagogic styles. I suppose almost come back to some of the ethics, I think in the humanities, I don't know about fine arts, but in the humanities certainly, they regard, or certainly some of our colleagues regard it almost as a self-taught subject in so far as somebody reads for a degree. And so I think for them, some aspects, they're innately suspicious of anything that smacks of spoon feeding in that way. Certainly from my institution, we have a sort of cohort of lecturers that, you know, are pretty 50-50 on the whole issue. So I think it's both a data issue, actually trying to find points, and that can be in attendance, it can be in library data, all sorts of aspects of the data can be, you know, limited if in those areas of teaching. So yeah, it is a challenge, and I think we're having to be quite persuasive with our academics. Obviously, I think we've sort of relaxed also as well in terms of our implementation, in that we're pushing at the open doors. So those academics who are keener to adopt and to look at this data and to use it, I think we're going to provide it for them, and not necessarily, you know, we're going to pick our battles, as it were. But yeah, it's a challenge.
Nick, and it's all, I've just realised the time, we're rapidly running out, so if you could provide perhaps a brief comment to that.
So I guess I was just going to pick up on what Ed was saying earlier. There are so many variables. To me, it's something that we have to look at, but whether we will conclude anything helpful, to me, is uncertain. The only analysis we've done is quite brief in terms of looking at the data, and what it tends to suggest is you can find the things that spot the things that make it really poor. So it should be possible to try and work out how you avoid disasters. But if you're actually trying to do, you know, improvements or excellence, it is really hard to find out how you can actually do that when you know, realistically have so many variables and relatively small amounts of data against each one.
Very briefly, please, Ed.
Okay, so number one, even though we have very different types of courses, students in arts courses in our School of Arts and Art and Design, the pattern is still there. Those students that do more tend to come out better, or do come out better on trend. But of course, we could be better with it, and we've had some very explicit criticisms from within the field of fine art. So we think, again, as Nick says, focusing much more on tailoring or making bespoke algorithms for different types of courses. There's a lot more work to do there.
Right, thank you all. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So, you've been a great audience. We will be demonstrating the Jisc Learning Analytics solution this lunchtime and this afternoon break on the mezzanine, and also tomorrow, I believe, at the morning break and at lunchtime. So if you really like to see the learning analytics in action and get a feel for how it works, please come and join a member of our team. I personally am confident that if we grasp this, there's a real opportunity here for us to grasp for the benefit of students and beyond for the sector, and I hope we very, very much can do that. Please give our panelists and other contributors a round of applause.